Guy retires in 2005 with $1 million, dies in 2035 with $5 million. Different guy retires in 2008, worst possible timing, right before the crash, still ends with 4.2 million. Woman retires in 2015 with 800,000, ends with 3.8 million. These aren't lottery winners. These aren't crypto bros who got lucky. These are normal people with boring portfolios who followed boring advice. And here's the part that'll make you question everything. Most of them spent their entire retirement terrified they were going to go broke. So what's happening here? Why are millions of retirees accidentally becoming millionaires while losing sleep over money they'll never spend? I'm going to show you the math that the financial industry desperately hopes you never see. So here's what we're actually going to explain. How the most conservative retirement advice in existence, the advice designed specifically to prevent you from going broke, is actually engineered to make you rich by accident. And why this creates a psychological trap that causes people to work years longer than they need to, hoarding wealth for a future that statistically will never arrive. This isn't about market timing. This isn't about picking the right stocks. This is about understanding the incentive structure behind the numbers you've been fed your entire working life. By the way, I built a free early retirement calculator because most online ones are mathematically wrong. It uses BlackRock and Vanguard logic to expose the weak points in your plan. And I only ask for your email to send the report, so I don't store any of your financial data. Link in the description. Okay, here's the central metaphor we're going to keep coming back to. Think of retirement planning like packing for a 2-week trip. You pack 14 pairs of underwear, right? Maybe 16, just to be safe. You pack extra socks, extra shirts, rain jacket, even though the forecast is sunny. You're preparing for the worst case scenario because running out sucks. Now imagine you get back from that trip and you've only used 7 pairs of underwear. The other 9 are still folded in your suitcase. Did you overpack? Obviously. Was it irrational? Not really. The cost of overpacking is minor. The cost of underpacking is walking around in dirty underwear. But here's where the metaphor breaks down in a fascinating way. When you overpack for retirement, those extra pairs of underwear don't just sit there unused. They multiply. You pack 9 extra pairs, and by the end of the trip, you somehow have 45 pairs. That's what's happening to retirement savings. The safety margin you build in doesn't stay static. It compounds. And that compounding creates these accidentally wealthy retirees who still think they're one bad market day away from eating cat food. Let me show you how this actually works, because the numbers are absolutely wild. The financial industry loves this one magic number, $1 million. It's clean, it's round, it makes for great headlines. But here's the reality check that nobody wants to talk about. The median net worth for Americans aged 65 to 74 is $410,000. That's less than half of that mythical million. Now, you might see articles throwing around higher numbers, like 1.8 million average. But here's the thing about averages. If I walk into a bar with 9 unemployed musicians and we average our net worth with 1 tech founder, suddenly everyone in that bar is a millionaire on paper. Doesn't help those musicians pay rent. You know what the real question is? Not whether you can hit $1 million. The real question is, what do you actually need? Because right now you might be grinding yourself into dust, chasing a number that has nothing to do with your actual life. You're delaying retirement, skipping vacations, saying no to experiences, all for a benchmark that was basically pulled out of thin air by someone with a different life, different goals, and probably a book to sell. Here's where the overpacking starts. The average retiree household, 65 and older, spends about $57,800 a year. That's roughly $4,800 a month. Not poverty, but also not buying a boat every summer. And here's what's fascinating. That number drops as people age. People between 65 and 74 spend about $60,800 a year. Folks 75 and older, down to $53,500. You see what that means? The older you get, the less you spend. Not because you have to, because you want to. You're not interested in accumulating more stuff. Travel slows down. You're not eating out 5 nights a week. Life simplifies. Now you might be thinking, but what about healthcare costs? Yeah, healthcare goes up, absolutely. But everything else drops enough that overall spending still declines. This isn't theory. This is what actually happens when you track real retirees through real years. But most people plan for the opposite. They imagine themselves spending more at 80 than at 65. That fear is what keeps them working longer than they mathematically need to. Let me show you what this looks like in practice. Picture a retired couple. Both work their whole lives, both collecting Social Security, about $2,000 each per month. That's $4,000 monthly combined, $48,000 annually. Remember that average spending number? About $61,000 a year for their age group. So they've got a gap of roughly $13,000 that their investments need to cover. Here's the question that breaks people's brains. How much do you think they need saved to cover that $13,000 gap? Most people hear that number and think they need at least $800,000, maybe $1 million to be safe. Wrong. If they're willing to withdraw 5% of their portfolio annually, which is actually pretty conservative given historical returns, they need about $256,000. Not $1 million, not even close. $250,000. Now, you're probably thinking, wait, 5% sounds aggressive. What about the 4% rule? Perfect. Let's talk about that, because this is where the entire system reveals itself. The 4% rule was created by a guy named William Bengen back in the 90s. The idea was simple. Withdraw 4% of your portfolio in year 1, then adjust that dollar amount for inflation every year after. Run that through every historical market scenario, every recession, every crash, every terrible time to retire in modern history, and your money should last 30 years. Sounds reasonable? Sounds conservative. Sounds safe. But here's what they discovered when they actually tracked what happened to people who followed this rule. In over 90% of cases, retirees who followed the 4% rule didn't just survive, they thrived. They ended retirement with more money than they started with. Way more. Michael Kitces, a financial planner who's essentially done the math on every possible retirement scenario, found that retirees following the 4% rule were more likely to end with 5 times their starting wealth than they were to run out of money. Read that again. You're more likely to turn 1 million into 5 million than you are to go broke. Why does this happen? Because the 4% rule was designed for the worst case scenarios in recorded financial history. We're talking about retiring right before the Great Depression. Retiring at the start of the 1970s, stagflation disaster, the absolute worst times to retire in modern American history. If you retire during average conditions, or better, that 4% is wildly conservative. A diversified portfolio historically generates returns that outpace that 4% withdrawal rate. Even accounting for inflation, even with market crashes, even with everything going wrong, your nest egg keeps growing while you're pulling money out. It's like packing 20 pairs of underwear, using 7, and somehow having 35 by the end of the trip. The math doesn't make sense until you realize the system was designed by people terrified of lawsuits and bad press. Financial advisors don't get sued when you die rich. They get sued when you go broke. So they build in safety margins on top of safety margins. And those margins compound. But now you might be thinking, okay, but people must be withdrawing that 4%, right? Wrong. JP Morgan did a study tracking actual retiree behavior. The most common withdrawal rate isn't 4%. It's not even 3%. It's 2%. 2. You know what happens when you only withdraw 2% from a portfolio, while the market historically grows at 7 to 10% annually over long periods? Your wealth explodes. You become accidentally rich while being scared you're going broke. It's the financial equivalent of packing for a blizzard, experiencing sunny weather, but still wearing your parka, because what if it gets cold tomorrow? Why are people so conservative? 3 reasons, and they're all psychological, which is exactly what I spend my time thinking about, because most financial mistakes aren't math problems. They're brain problems. First, habits. You spent 30 to 40 years being a saver. Switching to spending mode feels morally wrong. It's like asking a defensive driver to suddenly start speeding everywhere. Your identity rebels. Second, loss aversion. Every time you withdraw money and watch that account balance drop, it feels like losing, even when you're spending money on purpose, even when the math says you're completely fine. Watching your net worth decrease triggers something primal in the brain. We're wired to accumulate, not distribute. Third, uncertainty. What if I live to 100? What if there's another 2008 crash? What if? So you hoard just in case. Researchers call this the consumption gap, the difference between what retirees could safely spend and what they actually spend. For many people, it's massive, 50% or more. They could double their lifestyle and still die rich. Here's where it gets really interesting, because we need to talk about Social Security. And I know your eyes just glazed over, but stay with me. Social Security is the most underestimated part of retirement planning, and I think it's deliberate. The financial industry doesn't make money when you realize Social Security covers most of your needs. They make money when you're terrified and overpaying for managed accounts. The average Social Security benefit right now is about $1,900 a month. For a couple where both worked, that's $3,800 monthly, $45,600 annually. But if you were a high earner who maxed out contributions, you could be pulling in $3,800 a month individually. A couple of high earners, that's over $90,000 a year in Social Security alone, indexed to inflation, guaranteed for life. Now imagine that couple also has $1 million saved. They're spending $60,000 a year. Social Security covers $90,000. They don't need to touch their investments at all, but they still check their brokerage account every day, panicking over market swings that have zero impact on their actual life. Meanwhile, their portfolio keeps growing because they're not withdrawing anything. Here's a stat that makes this concrete. About 25% of retirees rely on Social Security for 90% or more of their income. Your first reaction is probably, oh no, that's terrible. Those poor people. But hold on, that statistic includes couples pulling in $75,000 a year entirely from Social Security who just don't need to touch their investments. They're counted in that 90% category, but they're not struggling. They're just not spending from their portfolio because Social Security covers their lifestyle. This is the part where the narrative breaks down completely. Let me give you a concrete case study. Real numbers, realistic scenario. Meet David. He's 62. He's been working as an engineer for 35 years. He's got $720,000 saved in his 401k and some IRAs. His wife, Sarah, worked part-time most of her career, raising kids, and she's got about $180,000 saved. Together, they've got $900,000, not quite that magic million. David's been planning to work until 67 because every calculator he's used online tells him he's short. Here's what actually happens if they retire now. David's Social Security at 62 is about $2,300 a month. Sarah's is about $1,400. That's $3,700 monthly, $44,400 annually. They track their spending for 6 months and realize they're living on about $68,000 a year. They could trim it to $62,000 without feeling deprived. That leaves a gap of $17,600 annually that they need their portfolio to cover. At 4%, they'd need $440,000 to cover that gap. They have $900,000. They're more than double what they mathematically need. But David keeps working because the online calculator said he needed $1.2 million. 5 more years. 5 years of alarm clocks and commutes and stress. 5 years he doesn't get back, all because he didn't understand the math. By the way, if David retires at 62 with $900,000 and only withdraws $17,600 annually, adjusting for inflation, he'll likely die with over $2 million. His kids will inherit a fortune he built by accident while being terrified he'd go broke. Now you're asking yourself, is this some kind of scheme to get people to retire early and run out of money? No. Because here's the thing about running out of money in retirement. It almost never happens the way people imagine. The Vanguard Research Group studied this. When retirees do run into financial trouble, it's not because their portfolio failed. It's because of 3 specific things. Unexpected health events that aren't covered by insurance, supporting adult children financially for longer than planned, or getting divorced late in life and splitting assets. It's life events, not market returns. The portfolio math works. The 4% rule works. What breaks people isn't the investment strategy, it's life. Here's the uncomfortable question nobody wants to ask. Is dying rich actually the goal? Look, if you want to leave a legacy, help your kids, fund a charity, great. Genuinely, that's a beautiful thing. But here's what I see constantly, and I mean constantly, in my own circle of business owners and professionals. People who aren't trying to leave a legacy, but they're living like they are. They're in their 70s with $2 million in the bank, still clipping coupons, agonizing over whether they can afford to visit their grandkids. That's not financial prudence, that's trauma. And some of these people are going to die with that money completely untouched, having denied themselves experiences they could have easily afforded, trips they didn't take, hobbies they didn't pursue, time with family they postponed. For what? To die richer than they needed to be? That's not winning. That's losing with extra steps. Here's a quick aside. I was talking to my accountant about this guy who's managed hundreds of estate settlements over his career. He told me the saddest files he reviews are the ones where someone died with millions, lived modestly their entire retirement, and their kids inherit money they didn't need while the parents missed out on life they could have afforded. He said, "I've never had someone on their deathbed wish they'd saved more, but I've read a lot of journals where they wish they'd lived more." And decide. Let me paint you a different picture, because maybe you're not trying to hit 1 million. Maybe you just want to know your number. Let's try a single retiree. They've got Social Security of $2,000 a month, $24,000 a year. Being single doesn't cut costs in half. Housing, utilities, insurance, most of the big fixed expenses stay the same. So let's say they're spending that typical $60,800 annually. Gap of $36,800 they need their savings to cover. At 5%, they need about $736,000. At 4%, $920,000. Still under 1 million. Living alone, covering everything themselves, and they still don't necessarily need 7 figures. But what about the couple that wants to live larger? Let's say they're planning $75,000 a year. Above average, but not outrageous. Maybe more travel, helping out the kids without stressing, going to restaurants without checking prices first. They've both got Social Security at $2,000 each, so that's $48,000 covered. They need savings to cover $27,000 annually. At 5%, they need $540,000. At 4%, $675,000. Still under 1 million. And these are people living well, spending more than typical retirees. See the pattern? When you layer in Social Security, which most people completely underestimate, and when you accept that spending typically decreases with age, that $1 million target starts looking less like necessity and more like a marketing campaign designed to keep you working and keep you scared. Here's the really mind-bending part, and I want you to sit with this for a second. The median retirement savings for people aged 55 to 64 right now is only about $185,000 to $200,000. Most people aren't even remotely close to 1 million. Yet somehow millions of Americans are retiring every year and living stable, comfortable lives. How? Because the system isn't built around one magic number. It's built in layers. Social Security, maybe a pension if you're lucky, some modest savings, maybe a little side income from consulting or a hobby, some home equity you could tap if truly needed. Stack those layers and suddenly you're in decent shape even if your brokerage account isn't impressive. The financial industry hates this framing because it suggests you don't need their expensive managed accounts to survive. But it's mathematically true. I've got several $100,000 invested. I've seen my own money compound. I've spent 10 years talking to accountants and fiscal lawyers who handle actual retiree portfolios. The math works. The issue isn't the math. The issue is psychology. Here's another quick cutaway. Financial advisor on a sales call, and I've heard this pitch because I've been on these calls, says to a prospect, you've got $800,000 saved, you're planning to retire at 64, but to be safe, you really should work until 67 and get to 1.1 million. What he's not telling you is his fee is based on assets under management. Every extra year you work and save makes him more money. His incentive isn't your freedom, it's his revenue. End cutaway. So how do you actually figure out your real number? Here's the system I use and recommend. Step 1, track what your life actually costs. Not what you think it costs, not what you hope it costs, real numbers. Track for 3 to 6 months if you need real data. Step 2, add up guaranteed income. Social Security is the big one. Go create an account on the Social Security Administration website if you haven't already. See your actual projected benefits. Add any pension, add any rental income, add part-time work you actually enjoy and would keep doing. Step 3, find the gap. Your annual expenses minus your guaranteed annual income equals what your investments have to cover. Step 4, pick a withdrawal rate you can sleep with. 4% is the classic. 5% if you're more aggressive or don't need the money to last 40 years. 3% if you want to be super conservative and die with a fortune. Divide your annual gap by that percentage. That's your number. Maybe it's $1 million. Maybe it's 400,000. Maybe it's 1.5 million. What matters is it's your number based on your life, not some headline designed to make you anxious enough to click. Here's the thing they don't tell you, and this is where we come back to the overpacking metaphor. Your retirement isn't a finish line you cross once and you're done. It's not a video game where you hit a number and unlock retirement mode forever. It's a lifestyle you're funding year by year. And if that lifestyle costs less than you thought, or if Social Security covers more than you expected, you might already be there. The tragedy isn't people who retire with 800,000 instead of $1 million. The tragedy is people who could have retired at 62 with 700,000, but worked until 67, chasing an arbitrary target they didn't need. 5 years they'll never get back. 5 years of alarm clocks and commutes and office politics and meetings that could have been emails. For a number that didn't matter. That's the real cost. Not money, time. Here's the fourth escalation, and this is the part that really makes me cynical about the whole system. The financial industry's entire business model depends on you being scared. Think about the incentive structure. If you retire early, you stop contributing to your 401k. The fund managers get less in fees. If you spend your money instead of hoarding it, the assets under management shrink. The advisor's revenue drops. If you realize Social Security covers most of your needs, you don't need expensive portfolio management. Every part of the industry makes more money when you work longer, save more, and spend less. I'm not saying there's a conspiracy. I'm saying the incentives are aligned against your freedom, and those incentives shape the advice you get, the calculators you use, the articles you read. Everything pushes you toward more. More saving, more working, more fear. Because more benefits them, not you. This is what I learned running a business for over 10 years. Follow the incentives. They explain everything. So here are your 3 practical takeaways. First, go calculate your real Social Security benefits right now, not later, right now. Most people are shocked by how much they're actually going to get. That number changes everything. Second, track your actual spending for 90 days. You probably spend less than you think on essentials and more than you think on stuff that doesn't matter. Once you know your real burn rate, you can calculate your real number. Third, stress test your plan by adding a 20% cushion, not a 100% cushion. If your math says you need 500,000, aim for 600,000, not $1 million. You want a safety margin. You don't want to die with triple what you needed. Look, here's the reality. Most people either don't need as much as they think, or they already have enough and don't realize it yet. The math is simpler than the industry wants you to believe. The targets are lower than they want you to think. Your timeline to freedom might be shorter than you've been told. And those retirees turning 1 million into 5 million, they're not geniuses. They're not lucky. They followed conservative advice designed for worst-case scenarios and experienced average results. The system is rigged in your favor if you understand how it actually works. Stop chasing headlines written by people who profit from your fear. Start chasing your actual life with your actual numbers. Because lazy investing built more fortune than crypto memes, and the most valuable thing you can invest is your time. The clock's ticking. Do the math. You might already be free and just not know it yet.